Hello and welcome back, everybody, to the final session of what I hope you agree has been a quite busy but a hugely interesting day so far. And yeah, we've really enjoyed the discussions across all of the different sessions so far, and we're looking forward to this final session, which is going to be moving things onto the high band frequencies. So we've looked so far, we've focused so far on the UHF band, we've focused on some of the mid band ranges and specifically the 6 gigahertz. So we're now going to be moving up into the millimeter wave frequencies, and we've got a session that's going to be looking at the emerging millimeter wave ecosystems, at the different use cases, technologies, solutions, and the economic viability of that ecosystem that's developing. So as I said, yeah, really looking forward to what I'm sure is going to be another great session of discussion around those issues. We've really appreciated all of your comments and all of your questions for the audience during all the sessions so far today. So please do continue with that. We really do want to hear your questions. And as ever, we will be putting those to the panelists in the second half of the session. But without further ado, I would now like to then welcome to the stage our moderator for the session, Rob Yates from LeMay Yates Associates. So Rob, welcome. Great to have you with us. And yeah, looking forward to it. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And welcome, everyone. I know it's the last session of the day, as Dan just mentioned. So we'll hopefully keep it lively and keep your attention on the, at least for a little bit. So the session, I have a couple just introductory charts. Section 7, emerging millimeter wave ecosystem. Of course, the emerging part is the ecosystem, not the millimeter waves. The millimeter waves have actually been around as long as any other waves have been around. And, people have been looking at these for commercial deployment for many years. The ecosystem, however, was an issue, a long time ago, and now that's profiting from miniaturization and standardization, everything else. So the technology ecosystem is really, I guess, where we're at, and how do you then manage frequency to address that? So let's go to the next chart. And so we have a great panel for you, and I think pretty much everyone has slides, so that'll help us with a good focus, looking at use cases, technologies, solutions, economic viability. In order of appearance, we have Branimir Stanchev from the European Commission, who will start us off, followed by Chris Wolford of Ofcom. I'll introduce each of them as they come up. Jose Aranda from Cellnex, Stuart Cook from the GSA, and Peng Zhao from OneWeb. So we have a great panel, and each of them has a very interesting presentation we'll go through. And if I go to the next chart, for those of you who don't know us, LYA, you may have said it in our showcase presentation a few minutes ago. We're a consulting firm. We're based in Montreal. We do work around the world, but a lot of it's focused on spectrum and auction-related things. We've actually sponsored this conference for many years, I think back to the 9th or 10th, so you may have heard of us from that as well. And we also do some in-house software development, so we're quite involved in auction platforms and related aspects of spectrum management, and particularly of note in the last few years, I guess, 5G spectrum strategy and helping operators and regulators understand, what bands are important, how much capacity is needed, and things like that, which brings us to millimeter wave. So if we go to the next chart, we've actually been involved in millimeter wave discussions for many years. And, there's a couple of things that have brought millimeter wave more into focus now, I guess, primarily for the purpose of our discussion here. The 26 gigahertz band. And we're talking millimeter wave. I guess in theory, the millimeter part starts at 30 gigahertz if you look at the technical part, and I think the official definition is 30 to 100 gigahertz. The 26 gigahertz, obviously just below that, overlapping the North American 24 and 28. So the 26 gigahertz, which was designated, I guess, in 2016 as the pioneer band, one of the pioneer bands for 5G. So a very important development that's, focused the industry on millimeter wave to some extent. The other sort of major event in the last few years has been the auctions in the US, which did 24 and 28 gigahertz, so in the same range, as well as some of the higher ranges, so 39 and 47 and whatnot. So we'll look a bit. So what are the themes of millimeter wave? Obviously the status of the 26 gigahertz as a pioneer band. There's very limited licensing of it in Europe so far, but we can certainly talk about that. Its role to play in the quantity of spectrum needed per operator. So the idea of the 1 gigahertz objective in the millimeter wave area. So that's kind of one big theme, the whole pioneer band and the which bands. Applications. So a lot of the applications are a little bit different than some of the other bands. So the localized use and venue applications which I'm sure we'll talk to, and some regulators have been assigning frequencies for non-carrier use or private network use. So we'll look at that. And then, of course, in a lot of these bands, and there is the upper part of the Ka band that overlaps with the 26 gigahertz band for satellite use, and other, satellite is in and out of a lot of these bands. And so there's questions of the role of satellite relative to the terrestrial, and how, or coordination, or, this or that kind of structure. How do you share? Is it traditional dynamic sharing? How do you divide up the bands? How do we share with satellites? So we're covering all these areas, and the various panelists we have all bring expertise in all, or some or all of these subject matters. So next chart, we'll segue right into the presentation, starting with Branimir. Branimir, I'm sure, is well known to most people on the call. He's with the European Commission and responsible for spectrum policy for wireless broadband and 5G, as well as research and innovation policy. He's been with the Commission since 2008 and has a PhD from Dresden University. So let me segue right over to Branimir and take it away.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the introduction, the kind words, and also thank you, Dan and team, for inviting me to present one more time at this very good conference. Yes, I think Europe has a big stake in millimeter wave spectrum. This spectrum helps reaching the gigabit objectives, the gigabit connectivity objectives, which Europe has set for 2025, and they have been also updated and widely extended with the recent digital decade communication. Millimeter waves are important for a fully fledged 5G deployment of innovative services. And they're a sort of frontier to be crossed in terms of technological commercialization, in terms of mindset and service take-up. They are also important for preparing the ground towards 6G, where one looks at even higher frequencies, the terahertz range, and I think this can go only through a mature development in the millimeter wave range. Next slide, please. So what are the obstacles and drivers we could recognize here with the take-up of this wide frequency range from 24 up to 71 gigahertz, at least in my consideration. I think what is in the red zone here is particularly three gaps, which are interrelated, of course. We have a lacking or staggering market demand. Focus of operators and spectrum users is very much currently on mid-bands. We have the overall investment difficulty, investing in, let's say, advanced antenna systems in denser networks when we talk about millimeter waves. And last but not least, the commercial equipment gap. Of course, there are a lot of announcements of equipment supporting millimeter waves. Yet for the European Pioneer Band, I don't think these are that many, and not so mature that we can say they're on the market today. But of course, Stuart can correct me later here, and I'll be glad to hear that. So what are further developments which give rise to more hope? Of course, we have the 5G trials in Europe, albeit less is happening in millimeter waves. We have a lot of international developments, also in the US, Japan, Korea, which are linked also partly to adjacent bands, but still promoting the overall ecosystem. And member states have started already to deliver on the obligation to assign at least 1 gigahertz of spectrum in the 26 gigahertz band, albeit this with quite different approaches, but we can discuss this later. I think that on the regulatory policy side, we have done a lot of work, and there are a lot of outcomes here at the European level. There is harmonized spectrum around 17 gigahertz in two bands, so the 26 and the 57 to 71, which is also suitable for 5G in license XZ mode. And we are looking at the 42 gigahertz band. There are ecosystems where European harmonized bands fit very well, and this was also partly due to the outcome of WRC 19. Around 2628 is the one tuning range, then around 40 gigahertz and around 60 gigahertz, 60 to 70. We have regulatory tools in place which promote investment, promote spectrum sharing, and also I can mention here, of course, the code, our regulation on small cells from last year, the toolbox of best practices which was agreed by member states with a view to incentives for broadband deployment, including access to 5G spectrum, and of course the recovery and resilience facility, according to which member states have to dedicate around 20% of investment to digital, and a part of it is connectivity. And we have, of course, the emerging vertical needs which drive potential take-up of spectrum. Next slide, please. So our priority when we are talking about further stimulating take-up here is, of course, to promote investment, to coordinate approaches of the member states in assigning, authorizing the spectrum in mmWave bands in order to ensure more coherent approach, in order to ensure an approach which is suitable for a single market of equipment and services. In this regard, one very good outcome recently was the connectivity toolbox, which among others addressed also the issue of, let's say, preferred best practice authorization of the 26 gigahertz band and also mmWave spectrum in general. And we can see here that the focus, what was agreed by the member states here and the Commission, the focus is on ensuring flexible authorization of this pioneer band, with focus on local licenses, on local licensing, and also on infrastructure sharing. This authorization should promote innovation, future-proof use cases. And in terms of local licensing, the so-called first-come, first-served approach was considered. We from the Commission very much favor this one, as it is a straightforward, easy, let's say, ensures easy access to spectrum and low administrative burden, low cost, and this could be applied also to other bands. In its recent opinion on the on additional spectrum needs, the RSPG just a few days ago also adopted an opinion, and one recommendation here is also referring to the mmWave spectrum. We are glad to see here that the RSPG recommends consistent approaches to authorizing this spectrum, in particular with view to verticals use and with view to local access. I think this comes quite timely. So that equipped with such, let's say, work outcomes and mindset, I think we should ensure in Europe really that approaches to authorizing in the first place 26 gigahertz spectrum are becoming more coherent. We have at the moment quite divergent, let's say, solutions which have been taken by fast-moving member states. In terms of coherence, I would say that it of course has to be combined with the overall principle of flexibility in a balanced way, and this could address two major aspects. One is the coexistence scenarios with incumbent users, and here we have already a practice in place to a certain extent, and also addressing what I call dual needs. For example, license versus license exempt spectrum, nationwide versus local licensing, the spectrum needs of vertical users versus public operators. And in this regards, a few elements which in my view are important are to ensure full band availability when we look at a particular band like the 26 gigahertz band, to ensure in Europe a sort of per band coordination among the member states, and to apply a sort of toolbox approach, so common solutions to common problems. And of course, to ensure in the first place that the most obvious entrants for this band or users with this bands are served. And I think here we should look with priority at fixed wireless access and vertical use, in particular for smart manufacturing like Industry 4.0 or smart cities. So this will be my overview. Thank you, and I give the floor back to Rob.
All right, thank you, Branimir. That was excellent, a great introduction to all of our topics. I think it was kind of one interesting point that I didn't put on my chart, but is very apropos, is that right now everyone is focused on mid-band, and that may be part of the question of why there's a bit less interest in 26. You kind of have to do one thing at a time. So that's a great introduction to the discussion, and all the other points as well. So let's move on to Chris. Welcome, Chris. Chris is probably well known to everyone as well, and he's the Director of International Spectrum Policy at Ofcom in the UK, responsible for the international spectrum interests, ITU, SEPTA, EU, and whatnot, and in particular represents the UK on the RSPG. And he's been with the UK government for a number of years, and has his degrees from Manchester University. So over to you, Chris. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Rob, and good afternoon to everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the UK, but also about some of the developments in Europe in response to the mmWave frequencies. So if we go to the first slide, or the next slide, many of you would have seen slides like this, and I think it's fairly common knowledge that in order to meet the connectivity needs of the future, we're going to need a mix of different spectrum bands, low, medium, high. But in addition, I think another important point here is that we need to think about how we make spectrum available in the future. And it's not, I think, just a question of national auction licenses and then some spectrum for license exempt use. I think we need to really think about what those emerging needs are. And light licensing regime, shared models, local access models are going to come increasingly to the fore, and particularly in some of these higher frequency bands. And that's been very much driving part of the UK's thinking. If we go to the next slide, in terms of our development of the spectrum sharing framework, which we've developed a year or two ago within Ofcom. And essentially the purpose of this framework is to enable a range of different use cases to get access to the spectrum that they might need. There are 4 bands that we identified as part of this: the 1800, 2.3, 3.8 to 4.2, and the 26 gigahertz band. So those spectrum bands, as I say, are available for localized licenses. So in the case of 26 gigahertz, there's 2.25 gigahertz of spectrum, which is available for indoor applications. Now, we have put an indoor tag on the 26 gigahertz band, and part of the reason for that was to ensure that we don't prejudice any future 5G use, particularly in terms of high power outdoor use that may emerge in the future. And I think when it came to the 26 gigahertz band, we were particularly aware that this is a band where technology applications are developing, and we wouldn't want to do anything that might hinder those future developments. That said, it is perhaps just worth noting that there's been quite a lot of interest in our spectrum sharing framework, including quite a lot of interest in the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz band. There has been much less interest thus far, quite limited interest. There have been some, but quite limited interest in relation to 26 gigahertz. And I would say that's quite limited interest either from localized use, industry verticals, or indeed from the mobile network operators. We just haven't seen that demand come through in any major form as yet. If we go to the next slide, please. In terms of sort of going up the frequency spectrum, another band that's of interest and has been mentioned by Rob is the 40 gigahertz band. And this is actually subject to a lot of discussion within CPT at the moment. There's the third EC mandate on 5G is being addressed within CPT, and that includes this 40 gigahertz band. And I think initially we thought that it was going to be quite a relatively straightforward task, essentially to transpose the results from WRC 19 into an ECC decision and into a report to the European Commission. In fact, it's turned into a much more difficult issue, or there's been much more discussion, and it concerns the coexistence between mobile networks that want to use the 40.5 to 43.5 gigahertz band and how they coexist with satellite use below the 40.5 gigahertz band. And it's particularly around that coexistence around that 40.5 gigahertz boundary with uncoordinated Earth stations that operate in the gigahertz below, 39.5 to 40.5 gigahertz band, which is a particularly knotty issue, which we're still trying to resolve. And we're trying to find a solution which is fair and balanced for both the satellite and the mobile community. The expectation at the moment is that work will be completed probably around about the middle of next year. So that's the 40 gigahertz band. If we move to my final slide, I'm going to keep going up the frequency bands. The other band that was covered in that third mandate from the European Commission on 5G is the 66 to 71 gigahertz frequency band. And whereas the 40 gigahertz band has taken us a little bit longer within CEPT, the 66 to 71, actually, we were able to do that slightly quicker than was originally anticipated. And what we did there was we confirmed that the existing technical conditions that are already in place in the 66 to 71 gigahertz band are sufficient to allow 5G services in the band. It is perhaps worth noting that there were one or two administrations that were slightly questioning of that, and particularly thought that there might be some higher power type 5G applications that might not fit within those technical conditions that are currently in place. So they are going to go away and think about that and possibly think about whether something needs to be developed at a national level. But generally, the conclusion was that the existing technical conditions in place through the existing EC decisions and the ECC recommendation are sufficient to enable 5G use. Moving back to Ofcom now and what we're doing in the UK, the final thing I was just going to mention, because I think it is just quite interesting, is up in the above 100 gigahertz range. And this is really sort of the future innovative type applications. 6G sometimes gets mentioned in this frequency band and what have you. We don't know quite how that spectrum may be used in the future, but we do think it has potential for those sort of innovative use cases. So Ofcom towards the end of last year has made about 18 gigahertz of spectrum between 100 and 200 gigahertz available for licenses on a non-interference, non-protection basis. We did look at whether we should just license exempt, but I think taking a sort of a relatively cautious approach in terms of not quite knowing how use of that band may develop, we decided to go for a light licensing regime in the first instance. And we've indicated that we do intend to review that in the future, probably around the sort of 2024 timeframe, to see how use of that band may be developing. So I think the conclusion of all of this is that there's quite a lot of work that's gone on in terms of developing the frameworks, all the way up from sort of the 26 through the 40, 66, 71, and indeed above 100 gigahertz. In truth, what I would say is that we have not as yet seen that much demand for this spectrum. Now that may emerge, but the demand, either, as I say, from mobile network operators or from industry verticals, or indeed from any other innovators, excuse me, hasn't sort of come to the fore as yet. But obviously, we are talking about innovative use here, so that innovative use may emerge over the coming years. I think I'll pause there, if that's okay, and return to Rob. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Chris. That was very interesting, and bringing in some of the other themes, a good segue from Branimir on the different solutions and different regulatory approaches and sharing systems. I guess, yeah, and we kind of stretched, and I said the millimeter wave, I think the official definition is 30 to 100, but you kind of stretch to 200. I guess at 200 gigahertz, we are actually about at a millimeter, right? So if we do the math, so we can...
A bit of artistic license, but...
Yeah, exactly. So we can stretch it to 200. So thank you very much, Chris. And let's move on to Jose. So Jose Aranda, he's with the EWIA, the European Wireless Infrastructure Association. I guess his day job is at Cellnex. So he's with Cellnex Telecom, an infrastructure provider. He's a technology evangelist who believes innovation is a tool to boost the development of the digital society. So he's going to have some interesting things to tell us. He's Innovation and Product Strategy Director at Cellnex. And he's been formerly with the GSMA, which everyone knows who that is. So no introduction there, and technology director there. And he's taken that experience into Cellnex and is an active participant in the industry. So let me pass it over to Jose.
Thank you very much, Robert. In this presentation, as it was mentioned, I will represent EVIA, and I will provide a little bit of additional view to the pure regulatory view. I will try to present a couple of use cases that our members are developing across the different countries. So as mentioned, EVIA is the European Wireless Infrastructure Association, and if we move to the next one, we are present in 14 countries. Our members are American Tower, A Towers, Action, Novec, Phoenix Tower, Data, TDF, Wireless Infrastructure Group, TowerCom, and of course my company Cellnex. And we have in total more than 100,000 sites across Europe, with a capital intensive and long-term investment with industrial commitment. We estimate that the assets that we manage value around 100 billion euros across all the continent. If we move to the next one, please. So why we think that our association is interesting is basically because we believe that the concept of sharing and the concept of neutral host give a lot of efficiencies. It gives higher colocation ratio, economic savings, but at the same time, it means a catalyst for European innovation. So we're able to provide faster time to market, and we enable a market that is growing in Europe and with long-term investment. Our towers and our agreements with the mobile operators normally goes beyond 10 years up to 20 years. If we move to the following one, please. So going now into the details on where members from EVIA are implementing millimeter waves, I would like to start with one project that we are leading in Barcelona. It's called 5G Catalonia, together with MásMóvil, one of the Spanish mobile operators, as well as the Spanish government. We have been defining the use of millimeter wave across the city, so Barcelona and the surroundings become a test bed of 5G experience. And for doing so, we have been partnering with a set of companies, big companies like Atos or Lenovo or NAE, and as well trying to promote the local ecosystem by doing proof of concepts and accelerating startups like Augmented Solutions, like Nearby Computing, and also partnering with other virtual mobile operators like Parlem. But what is also important is that we also not only partner with the equipment vendors and some of the participants of the project, but also the final users. And we have been able to make a strategic partnership with the city of Barcelona, that with the city council we are working very well, but also with key entities across the entire city, from FIRA Barcelona, SEAT, Intel even internationally, and ESA, 5G Catalonia, and 5G Barcelona. If we move to the following one, please. So what are we doing in Barcelona? So in Barcelona, we are basically implementing millimeter wave in certain use cases. For others, we use sub-gig, but in the end, we are implementing a 5G SA network with all the latest functionalities of edge computing capabilities, Open RAN, and V2X, enabling use cases for education, and we are deploying holograms with the business school, or private networks, 5G private networks with the local police, Guardia Urbana, or Open RAN in the beaches of Barcelona, or at the same time, delegate transportation with autonomous shuttles in FIRA Barcelona for the Mobile Congress. Also, we don't forget the Industry 4.0, and we implement with SEAT a use case on industry and automation, but as well local TV transmission and how you can use the edge computing to promote the transmission and production at the edge, and also trying to help the local market to have functionalities to enable a virtual assistant for grocery shopping. So this is an example that we have implemented in Cellnex, but if we go to the next one, I would like to also provide another example of ATC France, a project that is called Paris to Connect, where they have implemented a 3.5 kilometer course. And if you see, they have implemented 9 smart poles between Gare Austerlitz, Gare Lyon, and Gare Paris-Bercy in Paris. And they are partnering with Nokia, Signify, RATP, and Axiom, implementing in the smart poles different functionalities and also 9 hubs to connect with UBRs. If we move to the last one, please. So in this case in Paris, we are implementing 3 different use cases. The first one is ATCs providing urban services. So they are putting cameras to observe mobility of the city, monitoring airwave and noise pollution, but at the same time facilitating connections between vehicles and the infrastructure. In this sense, traffic lights, and also managing priorities of the traffic lights, also monitoring bus lanes. And the last use case that they are implemented is autonomous services. Autonomous service in terms of a shuttle bus that it runs autonomously in that area, but also autonomous logistics applied in the city. So with that, moving to the last slide, with that, I will conclude that our members are already implementing different proof of concepts with 26 gigahertz across different countries in Europe, and we will be more than happy to keep on working with the mobile operators and respond to any other questions you may have.
Excellent, Jose. Thank you very much. It's always good to have lots of examples of things that are emerging and moving, and that leads us quite nicely to the next topics. But it's always good to hear the looking at the neutral host ideas and the sharing regimes and how these things all fit together with the earlier discussion on licensing regimes and the roles of carriers and things like that. So with that, let's move further into ecosystem then, and we'll bring up Stuart Cook. And Stuart is the chair of the GSA Global Spectrum team. That's the Global Mobile Suppliers Association, of course. And he's also employed at Samsung. And so he brings a good background, and he's a director of regulatory and industry affairs there. And so hopefully he'll give us a good overview of developing ecosystems and where all these things are headed. So Stuart, over to you.
You're on mute, Stuart.
Thank you, Rob. So next slide, please. There are 2 aspects I would like to address. One is the state of the infrastructure deployments around the world. And the next one, the challenge Branimir gave me, was to talk about the device availability as well. If we look at the licensing of mmWave from a timeline, you can see some of the very early countries here, and then more and more countries licensing millimeter as we go along. And I'd like to pick on 3 examples of those early countries: United States, Japan, and Italy. And after the licensing, it then takes time to get the deployments underway. Next slide, please. So in terms of Italy, we have a company called, as an example, FastWeb in Italy, and they have a really ambitious objective here, is to provide broadband fiber-like connectivity to 12 million homes, around 45% of the population, up to 1 gigabit per second. And they want to do that by 2024, and to help close that digital divide, targeting municipality areas where fiber connectivity is low. And so launched this year with 50 cities, and then by 2024 around 2,000 municipalities. And that's using the upper part of the 26 gigahertz band. So a great example of how early licensing, and then several years later, we're now in the midst of deployments for a home and enterprise broadband delivery scenario. Next slide, please. And then moving to Japan, again, one of the early licenses issued. And if you look at the millimeter wave deployments, this time using 28 gigahertz and looking at the operators' deployments there, we can see over 8,000 base stations now deployed with millimeter wave capability. And that's actually 1 to 1.5 years ahead of the initial plan. So a lot of activity in terms of deployment. And so around 43% of the total 5G deployments, the base stations have this millimeter wave capability. And some of the use case demos from Docomo on that slide. Next slide, please. And so what about the United States? Again, one of the examples here is Verizon. This is the 28 gigahertz spectrum, and taken from the Investor Day graphics here, you know, a substantial amount of capital earmarked over the next 3 years for deployments. You know, the C-band there, a great combination of coverage and capacity, 7,000 to 8,000 sites by the end of this year. And on millimeter wave, an additional 14,000 sites planned this year, bringing the total to around 30,000 by the end of this year. And in the top right-hand corner, you can see the coverage map for Verizon there. The red indicates that the 5G coverage, and the darker red, that indicates that the millimeter wave coverage. You can see in New York City, in the canyons between the skyscrapers there, how the millimeter wave coverage expands. And this is by the Hudson River, so you can see a hot spot there in the ferry terminal. So that's how the licensing and then translates several years later into the beginning of deployments. And we've shown 3 examples, the US, Italy, and Japan. Next slide, please. But what about the local area networks? And we illustrate 2 examples here. One is in Taiwan, a smart factory owned by ASE in combination or partnership with one of the telecom operators and Qualcomm to enable artificial intelligence and automated guided vehicles, all enabled by, in this case, 28 gigahertz millimeter wave. There's a remote reality assistant and some more green tech AR experience. So a live real network in Taiwan there. And in France, 2 very interesting trials that we've highlighted here. In the port and Le Havre, some activities there with 26 gigahertz, but in using 2.6 as the anchor band. And then in Rennes, you know, a dual capability is being trialed here, public zones, hotspots, but also a business-to-business train maintenance, repair, enablement. So those are the examples. Next slide, please. And so what about the devices? You know, I'd characterize this as a lot of operators have focused on primarily mid-band and getting that up and running, and now beginning to think about millimeter wave. 3 of those operators have been advanced that we mentioned earlier in millimeter wave. And so the ecosystem is emerging. We have 5 chipset vendors active. We have devices listed here. In terms of the 26, the complete band 24.25 to 27.5, 9 devices this year, mostly the CPE and the modules and the terminals. You can see overall are emerging, and that to a large extent depends on the operator. They're ready to go, and we need the mobile operators involved here. And so next slide, final slide. This is a study from Analysis Mason. It was sponsored by 2 of the GSA members, Qualcomm and Ericsson, but it shows the potential for millimeter wave in terms of the net overall cumulative benefit to GDP in Europe. And some of the use cases: fixed wireless access, home and enterprise broadband development we talked about in Italy, urban and suburban locations, the Verizon example, the smart factories, the Taiwan example. So there are use cases out there that are beginning to emerge. So thank you very much, Rob. I'll hand back to you.
All right, thank you, Stuart. That was a great, another great segue, and focusing on ecosystem is clearly important. So between, Stuart and Jose, we've now covered, France, Spain, Italy, US, Japan. I think this is great, and Taiwan, I think. So super, and we'll certainly come back to these. I'm always curious about the infrastructure versus, end user handset discussion as well, because there's quite different environments. So we'll certainly probably come back to some of these points in questioning. So with that, let's move to our final speaker before we get the questions session. So Peng Zhao, who is the government affairs and policy, responsible for government affairs and policy at OneWeb, so a satellite operator. He's been in and around the industry for quite a while as a public policy executive, focusing on licensing and spectrum policy. He was previously with GSMA, so him and Stuart are probably old pals from way back. So we know the GSMA area, and looking at policy around the world. He has an executive MBA from London Business School, and he speaks English, French, and Mandarin. So on peut parler en français, but I think the Mandarin part, if you could kind of just, I think we'd have trouble with that. So anyway, over to you, Peng.
Thank you so much, Rob, for the introduction, and thank you to Forum Europe for the invitation for me to speak in that panel. I think it's always been a pleasure to participate in the discussion, and also this time with a slightly different perspective than I used to. So before jumping to the millimeter wave discussion, I just like to take a step back. Can I have the first slide, please? Just take a step back and have the connectivity, have a look on the status of the connectivity in Europe. And I think we all witnessed in the past, decades, the success of the mobile industry and the adoption of the smartphone, etc. And I think it's probably the most popular device and technology that people use to access internet nowadays. And I found this ITU reports which look at the population coverage of the world from different kind of generation of the mobile technology, and the 5G is not there yet. It's they probably put that in the next edition. And if you look at Europe, in Europe, doing fairly well. I mean, probably, especially when you look at the urban Europe, which is last bar here, it is about 100% of population coverage. So everybody have access to 4G, and that's in addition to whatever other fixed broadband possibility that people have. I think the gap is on the rural coverage, and the rural coverage, both in the mobile side but also in the fixed broadband. We still have people who doesn't have access to broadband internet. And if you believe this chart, I think in Europe, about 7% of the population only have 2G coverage or no coverage at all, and that translates to approximately 13 million population in Europe, and which is a minority, but it is something that can be a really real problem, because nowadays, especially during the pandemics, those 13 million people doesn't have access to education. Whenever the school is online, etc. And also information to health and etc. So that's really an issue that we look towards the policymaker, but also towards the telecom industry in general, that includes mobile and satellite and other industries that provide telecommunication, to solve the issue. Can I have the next slide, please? So with that, I think just a short introduction of OneWeb. You probably most of the heard about us. We are a satellite company, and we are trying to build a truly global kind of network from the sky to deliver very low latency and high speed internet to connect everyone and everywhere, and that's everywhere is especially important here. And in order to do that, we have a low Earth orbit constellation that provides really low latency compared to the more kind of traditional satellites. And we are planning to have about 648 satellites when the constellation is full after 18 launch. And up to today, we have 7 successful launch and 218 satellites in the sky, all operational. And with the next launch that is happening next week, we will be able to cover the whole northern pole and everything that is 50 degrees north latitude. So that includes UK and most of the northern Europe. And what we want to do with our network, I mean, one of the key business case for us is to provide the backhaul solution to mobile operators, and that includes 4G and 5G base station in the future, and especially in the remote areas where the fiber cannot reach. And we also will be able to serve terrestrial network to extend their kind of their reach to try to cover those 13 million people that are not connected in Europe. And of course, we will be able to serve segments that are where we don't have traditional terrestrial network nowadays, like air and maritime business. I have the next slide, please. So with that, I think just to be able to bring those game-changing service to the rural areas, and we, like any other kind of wireless industry, we need spectrum. And OneWeb mainly use the Ku band and Ka bands for our current generation of satellites, and our future generation will depend on the V band as well. So just quickly on the Ka band, I think as I mentioned previously, the 28 gigahertz used heavily by satellite industry for fixed satellite service on VSAT and on gateways. Ourselves, we're using that for gateways, and there's gradually more exciting kind of use cases as well with a station on mobile platform, as we call in CPT, or eSIMs, as we call in ITU, where we can provide, using satellites, we can provide broadband connectivity to the passengers in aircraft or ships, and also all the kind of trains and emergency vehicles, for example. And ECC has done a lot of work on that to harmonize and validate the usage of such fixed and mobile satellite usage in the 28 gigahertz. The next band is the V band. Of course, the Ka band, as we see, starting to get congested, even within the satellites. There's over 130 geostationary satellites that is using Ka band today. And there are several NGSO constellations like ourselves who are also using this band of the Ka band. So gradually, the satellite industry is looking at the V band, which is the 37 to 50 gigahertz, and as a kind of a new frontier, because that can provide the smaller terminals and can be used quite actively for the aircraft. And there are a lot of work already at the ITU. There's identification, as mentioned by Chris earlier, for the HDFSS between 39.5 to 40.5 in the region 1, and there are different identification in other regions as well. And OneWeb, we already have the ITU filings, and we have several in the FCC processing round to use this band for our feeder links. So it's really something that we want, from the government to provide assurance for the stability and availability of this spectrum in the future, so that we can have confidence into investing in development in that band. Last slide, please. And finally, just some observation on the millimeter wave for 5G. I think previous speakers also mentioned that the usage for the millimeter wave is quite different than the low band and mid bands due to the propagation characteristics, and also the coverage is fairly small. So it's really mainly used for hotspot areas. And also another thing thought as well is about the throughput. So when you provide so much access spectrum, you will have a huge fat pipe on the access layer, but you still need to think about the backhauling. And nowadays, so you can only really use such technology where you have the fiber networks. So it is not really for nationwide kind of deployment, and we see that as well from the the case of Verizon, who were one of the pioneers to use millimeter wave band for 5G, and they had to spend 45 billion to acquire more mid-band, and that's more than all their competitors combined. So from the FCC perspective, I think they also see that it is a kind of a shift to a more mid-bands to be able to compete with the rest of the world. And I just quote here the FCC acting chairwoman. So from our perspective, I think there's loads of spectrum available for 5G, and we would want to see a balanced approach, as mentioned by Chris on Ofcom side. There's a flexibility to use different part of the band. There's 17 gigahertz in total identified WRC19, and you can probably start with a less contentious band like a 26 or 66, 71, which is easier to solve. And a band like 40 gigahertz where there's contentious usage. I think that's something you can keep for later on and watch the development on the different industry and the needs. So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Peng. And we've got a bunch of minutes for questions. I think that was great to bring us back to the sort of the economics aspect of the use of frequencies and the I guess the evolving. I guess you mentioned policies and during the pandemic and things. I think there was some clearly evolution of spectrum policy during the pandemic as people did realize that they're actually regulators and policymakers did realize that actually, well, yeah, when you have to do remote learning, if you're on a lousy line or whatever, you don't have the coverage, then it's impossible to participate in. So to bring in participation, there are considerations other than economics. So that was a great finish to the panel sessions. So we have questions. I think we have time we have about 20 minutes, I think. I'm sure Dan will remind us in any case, but we've got three sort of, I guess I would call them thematic questions. So we'll take them one by one, and it kind of the three of them bring back just about everything we've talked about. So this will be really good. The first one is more or less directed to start with, I think with Jose, but probably we'll segue to Chris on it. So the question, and then anyone else obviously who has an opinion. So first question, beyond spectrum availability, what other regulatory challenges is the EWIA, the Wireless Infrastructure Association? What regulatory challenges are you finding for neutral host models? Are there things around domestic roaming, example for MNOs using the neutral host network, or numbering resource availability that may be a challenge? So since they mentioned EVIA in there, Jose, why don't you start us off on that? But I think, Chris, you had mentioned the sharing mechanisms in different bands, so maybe we should go to you after that. So Jose, do you want to start us off?
Yes, of course. So thank you very much, Robert. It's a very interesting question. What I will say is concerning all these regulatory challenges comes from where we see that there will be an exponential growth of this millimeter wave usage. We do think that the millimeter wave will be deployed basically in dense areas, and that means maybe a hotspots where you have a congregation of a lot of people and potentially the city centers. So if you see those 2 points potentially as a hotspots might belong to an entity that could be a stadium owner or could be a train station owner, it will be probably a local agreement between the private entity and the neutral host. So on the regulatory side, we see that we will probably have to look at cities in general, because the millimeter wave will be implemented in a first wave in the city centers. And we don't see challenges, but we see that regulation on small cells is determining how you are going to access to the infrastructure. Is it me that is hearing some background noise?
Seems to be an echo somewhere. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So to the point is that it
That's
seems
better.
that the European Commission is already considering how to help deploying small cells across the city, and we welcome that. And we welcome the possibility of have transparency on what assets can be used. we welcome the possibility of having clear guidance on what are the access rights to the different assets. And we welcome also homogeneous conditions for the different concessions with similar rules across different cities, so we don't have different differences or huge differences across different cities. So that's on the first question. On the second question, I will say that all of this that is happening on domestic roaming is competition, and as EVIA, we welcome competition, and we see that in the last 2-3 years, the market is getting more and more dynamic, and you see more and more competitors coming on play. And we see that the mobile operators have realized that they need to share if they want to build a feasible 5G network. And they can share between themselves, or they, when it comes to sharing more than 2 or 3 mobile operators, probably a neutral entity in the middle managing the infrastructure is the ideal scenario. But again, we always say that everything that is happening in the market will booster the implementation of the infrastructure that is so welcoming.
Okay, and interesting. Okay, so Chris, what's your take on that? The neutral host model, sharing, you had mentioned about competition from different ways, different bands, and different approaches. I'm seeing this echo on there again, but anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I fear. Is that any better? Is that echoing, or is that okay? Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a regulator, or I'm leading competition, so I think, I totally agree with Jose, and I think the interesting thing here is how the different models may emerge, and I think, I wouldn't see these as necessarily all competing with one another. I think there's opportunities for lots of different applications here. I mean, starting with mobile network operators, and sure, if they want to deploy in mmWave, they're going to be looking at presumably stadia, train stations. They're going to need to deal with where they put their base stations, and they're going to need a fair number of those. But that's stuff that they do anyway, and they'll just need to work with the infrastructure owners and work out how they can do that, but they're experienced in that. I think there's going to be then a choice for people, though. Do they want to get access through that mechanism, or do they want to have their own localized approaches, potentially industry verticals, factories, warehouses, that sort of thing, or indeed people organizing that neutral host type model. And I think there's a place for all of these potentially, and it's not for me as a regulator to determine which is the right one. It's just the aim is to provide the opportunity for all these different models to flourish, and we can see what consumers actually want.
Okay, no, that makes sense. I guess, to me, the discussion point too is around this. So we're talking about a neutral host model. Does it apply to mmWave, or are we having common? That's why I was thinking of you, Chris, because of the common structure with another band. You mentioned 3.8.4.2. Are there different ways of, how, to what extent these are band dependent? I guess is an interesting, part of that question. But does anyone else want to chime in on the neutral host model question and or other aspects of it that, as I mentioned, domestic roaming and other challenges around, sharing basically? Branimir, you're up. You want
Maybe.
to?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me well.
Yep.
There's no noise. Yeah, I could add to this the aspect of small cell deployment. I think that neutral host is something which we at least envisaged and targeted with our small cell regulation, which came in as a result of the code, and the code also further enhanced, let's say, the conditions for deployment by facilitating access to public infrastructure. We have a binding provision there. That's why the Commission came up with the regulation of small cells, and we took an approach there to ensure that certain, let's say, technical, physical parameters are given, or boundaries are given, under which operators can deploy in a light mode throughout cities. And I think this also addresses very well neutral host deployments in small cell scenarios. I think this is another facilitator in this regard I can refer to.
Okay. If that's good for that question, why don't we move to the second one? I think that's some really good discussion points. There's a lot in these questions, so we could obviously talk all day on them. So question 2, and I think this one actually, Branimir, this is a good segue for you. I think this is more directed towards you, but also probably secondly, I think, Stuart. So maybe those would be our focus for question 2, and then we can see if anyone else has comments. So question 2, the US has been leading the way on mmWave 5G. A few of you mentioned that actually with Verizon and whatnot. Now that they have access to more mid-band frequencies, however, it seems the demand and focus on mmWave there is shrinking. Does the panel think this will have any impact on Europe and the global ecosystem more broadly? So there, obviously, Branimir and Stuart. So Branimir, why don't you start us off on that one?
Yeah, sure. I could hardly predict how things may develop in the US, but indeed, with more focus on mid-band spectrum, maybe the momentum around mmWave may decrease, but I still don't see a reason that both do not go hand in hand. Finally, operators have already developed investment plans also for mmWave, and deployments are ongoing there. Mm-hmm. But of course, the shift of focus can be there. And while the US and the European developments mutually influence each other and the ecosystems are dependent in a way, I would say that the European Union should really develop a very solid, or has been developing a very solid approach on its own in order to ensure the take-up of, let's say, 5G frequencies and to foster the deployment and the investment in 5G. And I think this should be our major focus, to follow what we have already built and to continue our own momentum. I have already referred to the framework we have created for investment and for spectrum availability, for coordination of spectrum approaches of national regulators. And I think this coordination is key. It is being well developed in the context of the connectivity toolbox, and which now has to be implemented for the next year. And I can also refer to the peer review forums which have been established with the code. And now we had already 2 peer review forums of national regulators which meet and discuss about the upcoming spectrum authorization procedures, and other peer review forums have already been planned. I think this is an appropriate opportunity where regulators meet, exchange views, and last but not least, ensure a more consistent approaches to the take-up of mmWave bands and licensing and meeting the demands of different users.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess, it does seem a bit dramatic to say focus on mmWave is shrinking. And, I think one of you mentioned it's maybe a question of timing more than anything. So, you have to roll these things out. I think the US case is interesting as well, and hopefully Stuart can add a bit more flavor on this. But, there's a Verizon 5G, right, which was initially high band and then segued into being a combination of mid band and high band. And then, there's the T-Mobile /Sprint 5G, which was really initially focused on 600 megahertz to provide broad coverage and then reinforced with mid-band. So the kind of, these Gs are not always the same thing everywhere. So Stuart, how does that roll into ecosystem and the other part of the question there, the global ecosystem and where are things headed?
Yeah, and Rob, T-Mobile in the US also purchased 26,
sure.
Right?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So I know it's obvious, but it really is that combination of spectrum from low, mid, and high bands. That's what is really needed. And as Branimir said, lots of the operators started with mid-band. It's a great combination of coverage and capacity. And that's how many of the operators have invested and launched and rolled out initial 5G. But there is that home and enterprise broadband scenario if you don't have fiber or you want to compete with fiber. And then there's the hotspots inside buildings, but also outside in high dense areas. And Verizon is one example of an operator that had lots of high band spectrum, has now purchased lots of mid band. And China's very interesting as well in terms of 26 gigahertz. So lots of deployment at mid-band, but now growing interest in mmWave and the same with Australia. So from our perspective, from the vendor perspective, we actually see an increase in interest in millimeter wave. Now lots of the initial mid-band deployments are underway. So it depends on what spectrum you have and what you've just acquired, I think, in terms of where we are. But it's very early days for millimeter wave from my point of view. We're just getting going.
Yeah, I guess is it fair to say, as a segue to that question, though, that the mass market use of millimeter wave is what will eventually, force the ecosystem to be more mature. I guess, I'm thinking, for example, the most obvious one, the iPhone, right? It has the North American millimeter waves in the U.S. Device, but other than that, it doesn't support them. Do you have any view on that from your view of devices?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, Rob. So we need, from a devices point of view, we need the mobile operators involved here. Right. So the verticals and the private industries can leverage the scale, but we need the mobile operators to get that terminal mobile phone market going for millimeter wave. Verizon has done that with 28 gigahertz mobile devices, but we need the operators maybe at 26 and not quite there yet, but once they're there, the terminal device market will emerge, and that's when the other verticals can also benefit from the terminals. Chipsets and fixed wireless access equipment, of course, is there, but the handsets, we need the operators. And that's why, from a licensing point of view, we would encourage regulators, whatever they do at millimeter wave, allow the operators to participate as well.
All right, sounds good. Okay, we only have about 10 minutes, and actually got one more question too. So there's two more questions. I think this one starts probably with Peng. So I think it's a good start with that one, and we'll see who else wants to chime in. So question 3, to what extent will millimeter waves be able to provide indoor coverage from outdoors? I guess I mean distinguishing indoor from outdoor coverage, given that most of the high bitrate consumer services are used when people are not moving and therefore usually indoors. Peng, what's your view on that?
I thought that's probably more a question to Stuart.
I thought it was a good satellite question, because the satellite indoor versus outdoor. As
I mentioned, one thing doesn't change whether it's mobile industry or satellite industry. It's like the higher you go in the frequency, the more difficult it is to penetrate walls, right? So we know that at that level, I think it's really, really difficult to go through one wall or two walls. So it's either you do outdoor to outdoor coverage or indoor to indoor coverage at this frequency band. So I think that's my only take on that. But I think probably Stuart can.
Well, actually, I was thinking more of Jose, so he's got his hand up. Jose, why don't you come in on that one? I was thinking actually more of you as a second opportunity. So go ahead.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting question, and I agree with you that you will have to have mid-band and you will have to have millimeter waves, and millimeter waves outside probably won't have a lot of success to enter indoor, and that's why the mobile industry and also the infrastructure provider are already working on how to establish coverage indoor. And indoor things like undergrounds. And I just saw a news today that finally the underground in London will have coverage. We will need to wait until 2024, but it is a good step. And therefore, there is an opportunity, for instance, for the infrastructure provider that will implement that to put millimeter wave inside. But we also have several places where we still don't have coverage. For instance, parkings, and you see that subterranean parkings is a place that you will normally not have coverage, and therefore there is an opportunity for the millimeter wave, and there are different use cases and business cases where it says if you enable that, car sharing can be enabled also inside parkings, and you can go and pick up your car shared inside the parking. So I mean, there are always different use cases. I see that we will have to rely on indoor coverage for different scenarios. Also, a large building and a skyscraper, you cannot cover in a skyscraper with an outdoor antenna. You will have to distribute the antennas across the building, and that goes with tunnels, that will go with other infrastructure. So I would see that really it will have to coexist.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now that makes sense. And I guess, yes, we obviously don't have time to go into all this in glorious detail, but there's clearly a distinction between sort of the vertical end user applications, which may be indoors and therefore in their own little space, versus sort of the broader mobile coverage. And then there's some overlap like venues and things like that. Really good. I don't know, Stuart, if you had a 30-second to add to that, since Peng thought you had an opinion on this, because there's one more question I'd like to get to. But
it's tough getting from outside in with millimeter wave, particularly with modern buildings with their thermal properties.
Sure. Yeah.
And as Jose said, there's a lot of challenges, business challenges, to get indoor coverage, and maybe shared networks or neutral hosts is one way to go. What's interesting is with millimeter wave outdoor deployments, the operator can use their mid-band spectrum to serve indoors. So this is one of the strategies some of the operators are thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So use millimeter wave outdoors and use more of your mid-band capacity to target indoors.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, let's go to the fourth question. We've only got a couple minutes left. So, and this will bring us back to, unfortunately, Chris seems to have dropped off, but it's a good sort of regulatory. So we back to the start, and we'll get Branimir will have to handle it. Chris is back. Okay. So the fourth question, what's in the future of 5G millimeter wave band used for integrated access and backhaul? So they called IAB as another acronym for everybody. And any regulatory considerations about that? So I don't know, Branimir, why don't you start us off on that, or Chris? But I think those are regulatory type questions.
Yeah, I can start, and of course others can continue. I personally would not see any regulatory obstacle to integrated access and backhaul once, for example, an operator user has a license for the 26 gigahertz band, for example. In the 60-70 gigahertz range, this is license exempt. So overall, I would not see any need for special treatment. Operators could deploy this as long as their, let's say, access part is properly authorized. Yeah.
Okay, isn't there, although you said not unlicensed, but in the license context, are there often regulations related to that?
We don't have such distinction, and I think the backhaul part can be equally covered by operator who has already rights of use, of course, under the consideration of the applicable technical conditions. Yeah.
Okay, Chris, any view on that?
Well, I agree with Branimir, and I don't see any particular obstacles. I do think it's worth noting that the 26 gigahertz band is likely to be more complex. And I think that's for a number of reasons. But, you know, for example, I mean, 3438 C-band, I mean, we've licensed that nationally across Europe in pretty much the same way as we have 1802 gigahertz, the previous incarnations of mobile technologies. I think when it comes to things like 26 gigahertz, there are a range of other questions that are going to need to be answered. And I think regulators are thinking about what is the best way of getting the 26 gigahertz band spectrum out there. I mean, we know that it's more likely to be used in very dense urban areas. It's not something that's going to be used across the country as a whole. It's not a coverage layer. So that gets questions about coverage, questions about getting it indoors. Again, another one, you know, how what does this mean for the ways in which that spectrum should be made available? So I do think it's more complex. I think it comes back to the question as well about Verizon, in the US and what happened. I mean, I do believe that Verizon probably picked millimeter wave partly because they wanted to do FWA, but partly because that was the spectrum that was available at the time.
Sure.
And actually, as more mid-band spectrums become available in the US, that's looked more attractive in the short term, but who knows what's going to happen in the longer term. And I think from a regulatory perspective, we just need to be ready to respond to that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And there's one thing is common with spectrum is we always need more of it. So as things go forward, more and more bands mature, and people will use them. So I think we're pretty much out of time. Dan hasn't come back on to bump us off, but I think we're supposed to be finishing about now. And so I think that's been a great session, and there's no other questions, and it would take us a long time to address some of these in more detail. So I can't applaud everybody, but thank you very much. And it's been a really good session. And I think that's pretty much where we're at, unless someone has any other closing remarks before Dan comes on. Oh, there he is. All right. Dan, we finished on time for you.
You did. I'm very impressed, Rob. Thank you so much for that.
Experienced panel here, so we're
that's it, an expert panel. So
exactly.
So yeah, no, thank you, and that was again a really interesting discussion. So thank you, Rob, and thank you to all of our panelists for yet another great discussion. So I do really appreciate that. So thank you all very much indeed. But as Rob mentions, that's it now. That's it for that panel. That's it for the day. So we've had, I think, 5 plenary sessions today and 4 showcases as well. So a very busy day. And again, to remind you, if there was anything that you've missed out on, then there will be an email being sent out with copies of the presentations for all of the speakers that have been made today, and also recordings of all of the sessions. So that'll be coming out to you very shortly. And then we're back again tomorrow. So we start tomorrow at 10 o'clock, slightly later tomorrow, so 10 o'clock Central European time, where we're going to be looking at, first of all, WRC23 and beyond, focusing both on WRC23, but then also maybe looking a little bit beyond as to the visions towards 2030. We then have a number of Spectrum shorts, as we're calling them. So these are shorter sessions, 45 minutes each, focusing on specific issues. So we'll be telling you more about those tomorrow morning. And then we have our closing ceremony, where we're going to be hearing from a number of people on their closing remarks from the sessions. And we also actually have some live music. We have a band, the Sweet Beats, who those of you who attended the 5G conference might remember. They were here for the closing ceremony for that, and they're coming back and they're going to be playing us out with some live music at the end of the day tomorrow as well. So yeah, all of that is still to come. But for now, thank you so much to all of our panelists in that last session, and to Rob, and of course to all of our speakers and panelists throughout the day today. Thank you to all of you out there for all of your contributions, for your comments, for your questions, and for your participation at the various sessions. As I said, we're back here slightly later tomorrow, so 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. So please do make sure you're back here for that. But until then, wishing everyone a very pleasant rest of the afternoon and a pleasant evening. And as I said, we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you all very much.